off right now! Hey, show me your hands. Drop it! Drop it! Shots fired, shots fired. Get an ambulance up here now.
NBC's Rahema Ellis is in Chicago covering this story for us. Rahema, tell us, how are the family doing? What are their legal representation and the Chicago community saying? How are they responding to all of this?
Casey, the attorney for Adam Toledo's family is saying that this did not have to end as tragically as it did. They believe that the officer did not have to use deadly force. They say that whether Adam had a gun or in his hand at some point or not, they say when the officer shouted at him, screamed at him to show his hands, they say that the teenager complied. And there is video of Adam standing with his hands up, and it appears he does not have a gun in his hand at that moment. And because of that, the family is saying deadly force was not necessary. But police are quick to point out, and in police-edited video, it shows that this exchange happened in less than a second. It was milliseconds that it took this exchange to occur. The officer has been identified as 34-year-old Eric Stillman. He's been placed on administrative duties. But his attorney has been responding to all of this. His attorney is saying, I quote, their client was faced with what they call life-threatening and deadly force situation, and that's why he discharged his weapon. The community has been calling for accountability and a change in the way that the police, if you will. There have been protest demonstrations over the last few days, including last night. It was peaceful. Another demonstration is planned for tonight, and authorities hope that that demonstration will be peaceful as well. Casey?
All right, Rahema Ellis in Chicago for us. Thank you very much for that report. Let's go now to our panel. NYU law professor Melissa Murray, civil rights attorney and former prosecutor David Henderson, and Eddie Glaude Jr., chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. Thank you all for being here. And Melissa, let me start with you. We heard former Washington, D.C. Police Chief Charles Ramsey say that the officers' actions were reasonable. What is your analysis of what we see on that video of this, again, 13-year-old boy?
Again, we have very little evidence other than the video, so it's hard to make confirmed conclusions about what happened and what the officers were thinking at the time. But again, this was a 13-year-old boy. He was unarmed. He has his hands up in the video. That seems to be important evidence to think about as we think about going forward. But again, I think there's a broader issue here. We've had in just the last week a spate of these police killings of unarmed individuals. And I think it prompts a conversation about the nature of policing in this country. And, perhaps the Chauvin trial could have been a conduit to that kind of conversation. But understandably, the prosecution really was at great pains to paint Mr. Chauvin as a rogue cop rather than take on the broader question of whether the policing protocols were appropriate in this particular instance. So this was perhaps a missed opportunity to have a larger conversation, but these other police killings perhaps give us another opportunity to engage more deeply with the question of whether public safety really is top of mind when we are thinking about police protocols.
Well, and Eddie Glaude Jr., so much pain across the country. Minneapolis, Brooklyn Center, now Chicago, communities grieving the loss of these pieces of themselves, essentially, especially for the family members of the victims here. To Melissa's point, how do we figure out how to move forward and have the next iteration of this conversation? What do we need to be focused on right now?
Well, let me just say, Casey, you're absolutely right. There not only are families grieving, but you can imagine as these images are on loop and they're kind of layered on top of each other, you have to imagine communities, Black folk around the country, terrorized in interesting sorts of ways, in problematic ways, by having to see these images over and over again, not only because they're horrific, but because they generate an occasion for us to worry about our own family members, about our own lives, about our children, our husbands, our wives, our aunts, our mothers, our fathers, that sort of thing. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we have to understand that for a generation, that the age of Reagan was defined by a form of policing Black and brown communities that had violence at its core. We thought of these folks as super predators. We thought of tough on crime as the way in which we modeled it. Remember, the black box in Chicago emerges out of this framework. You think about ramparts in Los Angeles. You think about the very ways in which our communities have been perceived to justify this form of policing. So we have to, in some ways, Casey, just very quickly, challenge the underlying assumptions
You've
about
got the floor, Eddie, as far as I'm concerned.
and surveilling. Containing and surveilling and incarcerating black folk, brown folk, right? We have to challenge what Melissa just suggested. We have not challenge, we have to interrogate what we mean by public safety when it comes to particular communities.
So, David, let me get you to weigh in on that and tie it in with, Melissa mentioned the Chauvin trial. Obviously, a trial is a very specific case. Their goal is to bring justice and to see Derek Chauvin convicted, so they have to be very specific. But this bigger question that we're grappling with here about how we think about policing, just follow up on what Eddie had to say. What's your view of all of these complicated and thorny issues?
Absolutely. I can tie in what Professor Murray and what Professor Glaude just said because they're represented in George Floyd's trial and Derek Chauvin's trial for murdering George Floyd. And it goes back to a witness who said something that's been echoing in my mind since I heard it. Mr. McMillan said, "You can't win." He said that to George Floyd, "You can't win." And that's the thread that ties all these cases in the news together. And this isn't just theory. I mean, I've been ordered out of my car on 3 different occasions, stopped many times. But 3 different occasions, the officer stands on the outside of your car and motions for you to get out and approach. Once they start giving you those commands, what do? If you ask for mercy, George Floyd did that, didn't matter. If you don't obey the command directly as it's given to you, you get a situation like what happened to Lieutenant Nazario. You get in trouble, you get tased, and let's be honest, that's what led to Daunte Wright's death. And then if you follow the commands and you raise your hands like you're being told to do, you run the risk of getting shot. And so the situation we're creating is one where you leave people without hope, and that's when things are on the verge of combusting, as we're seeing in Minneapolis right now. The only thing that has led to change, I'll tell you this as a civil rights lawyer, the only thing that has led to meaningful change is people taking to the streets and protesting, but we're getting situations where we see this common playbook where authorities make promises that they know they don't intend to keep, and I think that's also what's going on in Brooklyn Park right now.
All right, David Henderson, Melissa Murray, Eddie Glaude, thank you all for being part of this very important conversation today. I'm sure we're going to hear your voices continuing on as we unfortunately deal with this epidemic in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you.